Welcome, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get started because I want to keep us on schedule here. We've got 4 exciting presentations for the CIRMMT-ACTOR Symposium on Orchestration Research here in spring of 2022. So my name is Lindsay Remore. I'm one of the ACTOR postdocs, and I will be emceeing today. But my goal is to stay out of the way as much as possible and make sure that we have time for presentations and for questions. So we're looking at 4 presentations of 20 minutes with 10 minutes of questions following each one. If you want to ask questions, you can do so in the chat or by raising your hand during the Q&A period at the end. You can put the questions, if you have them in the chat and they pop into your head during the presentation, you can go ahead and just drop them in the chat, and then we'll get to them afterwards. I also have the ACTOR team here, Stephen, and of course Bob and Andre, and Matt Zeller and Kit Soden. Matt is our official Zoom monitor, so we'll be dealing with Zoom issues and helping with the Q&A. So without further ado, let's get started with our first presentation from Victor, explaining mental representations of sound semantics. So Victor, are you there? And
yes,
are you able to, hi, it's good to see you. Are you able to share your screen? Is the tech
Yeah, I'm
up
trying
and
right
working?
away.
Okay. So take a second to get that set up. I see a screen. It is a desktop.
And now it's a presentation.
And now it's a presentation. Yes. Oh, one more thing I want to say before we're starting. I almost forgot the only announcement I had to make, and that is we are recording this session. The recordings of the presentations will be put up on YouTube. We'll be editing the Q&A out, but if you don't want to be part of the recording, you can always have your camera turned off. That does not go for the presenters, obviously. All right, Victor, if you can give us a 1-sentence introduction of yourself and then go ahead and launch in.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Lindsay. So hello, everyone. So my name is Victor. I'm a 3rd-year PhD candidate at IRCAM, STMS Lab. And so my overall research topic is about the meaning and acoustic representations of some elements of the vocabulary of timbre. And today I'll be presenting the last experiment I led during my PhD, that here I call measuring. So the name is a bit different. I apologize. It's called measuring the shared mental representations of sound concepts. So this work is funded by Le Fonds pour la Musique. I'm supervised by Patrick Suzini, Olivier Wix, and Nicolas Misdaris at IRCAM. And it's in collaboration with my colleague Pablo Arias from STMS Lab and Lund University. So to give you some context on this study, it was from it started from the observation of the communication between sound experts that relies in the fields of sound and music, that relies a lot on the common understanding of some sound concepts like brightness, warmth, or darkness. And so you can hear those terms in professional conversations, for instance, during an orchestra rehearsal between the conductor and musicians, during a music lesson between the teacher and the student, or for instance, during a mixing session between a sound engineer and the composer. So what we can say about this vocabulary is that it's quite metaphorical, meaning that terms like brightness, for instance, firstly come from the sensory domain of vision, and that warmth comes from touch. And due to that fact, it is therefore polysemous. And so the question we asked ourselves here is, are the mental representations associated with those sound concepts similar between populations with different sound educations that could be brought to communicate at some point professionally? So there are 2 objectives for this study here. So the first one would be to be able to acoustically explain the representations of those sound concepts. So in order to choose them, we based our work on this study called Speaking About Sounds of Maxime Caron, that worked in the same team as me a few years ago. And so he built this sound lexicon with a category oriented toward the description of timbre. And it's in this category that you find all these metaphorical descriptions. And this led to a work we did 1 year ago. We called Investigating the Shared Meaning of Metaphorical Sound Attributes. And so we focused our work firstly on the relations between the concept of warmth and roundness that seems to be really, really close. And we wanted to find a way to reveal the subtle, maybe difference that would exist between them. And one thing leading to another, we wanted also to find the relation that would exist between these two terms and brightness, which is quite known as being related to spectral centroid, and roughness that is supposed to be, according to the literature, orthogonal to brightness. So starting from there, we also wanted to evaluate the influence of the expertise of different groups of participants on the representations of these sound concepts. So we took as participants for the experiment 3 kind of profiles. The first one was sound engineers that have a technical knowledge on sounds, conductors that have this kind of intermingled knowledge of from music and sound. And we also took non-experts because we were interested in these really, I want to say, pure usage, metaphorical use of these concepts when describing sound, because they are not used to do it commonly in their everyday life or professionally. So now we go to wonder what question we should ask in order to get that information. So the goal of our experiment was to being able to label a musical instrument sound dataset with the 4 concepts. So we showed the method of best-worst scaling. So it's a relative judgment method used to collect subjective judgments on a set of items. And so during a best-worst scaling at each trial, participants have to choose the best and the worst item within a group of 4 or 5 items, according to the subjective dimension that is studied. And so here you have an example with the face attractiveness, where in this trial, the participants have to choose the most and the least attractive face. So we chose this method because it actually showed some perks to be used in many items designs. So we read these 2 papers first that they showcase the usage of best-worst scaling compared to the use of rating scales in many items designs in crowdsourcing contexts. So specifically, we got inspired by the paper of Hollis. So here you have an example of a best-worst scaling interface. So the idea here is that if a participants choose item A as being the best item and D the worst item, the basic usage of best-worst scaling would be to average the number of best and worst annotations of this item. So Hollis tried to go a little bit further in order to optimize the number of annotation by considering not only those informations, but all the duals, all the relations between the items that would be induced by this choice. And so then by applying, it's called then a tournament paradigm. And so by applying a scoring algorithm based here on the Rescola-Wagner model, we take advantage of the diversity of trials and the multiple presentation of items. And we try to disseminate the information about duals in the dataset. And thus we're able to scores and obtain a ranking of items from worst to best. So now we applied this paradigm to sounds in a preliminary experiment. I think I'll go a bit quick on this one because I don't have so much time, but here the idea was to compare best-worst scaling with a rating scale, which is a more classical approach when we want to get subjective judgments on sounds. And so we asked participants to evaluate brightness of 100 sounds using both methods. And we evaluated both methods on validity, reliability, and participants' impression on the method. And so the idea here on the results, sorry for skipping a bit this, is that the 2 methods were quite equivalent when evaluating brightness. And so validating the usage of base-word scaling for what we want to do, meaning evaluating perceptual the perceptual aspects of sound properties. And even though we were expecting base-word scaling to be better, there is still some room to find other ways to compare the methods because it's not quite the same as the previous study that did that in crowdsourcing designs. Anyway, so the method works. And so we can move on to the real experiment we led. So here you have an overview of the study. First, we're going to focus on the base-word scaling experiment I was telling you about. So here we have all, the three groups of participants: sound engineers, conductors, and non-experts, that would evaluate a dataset, orchestral sounds dataset of 520 sounds with the base-word scaling methods and on brightness, warmth, roughness, and roughness. So in numbers, it would mean that the task for one concept would be of 130 trials plus 10% retest trials to evaluate intra-participant consistency. It corresponds to a duration of 40 minutes per concept. And I added here that we have this constraint of presenting only one pair of sound in the overall experiment for each concept in order to maximize the information disseminated. So already with this, without the acoustic analysis we can get, we already have some really interesting behavioral results that would give information on the scores relation between groups, between concepts, and some consistency information. Starting with the consistency, here are the results for the inter-participant consistency evaluation. So to do that, we took the metric called compliance, which corresponds to the proportion of corresponding duals of sounds between scores and choices made by the participant. So in other words, it means that if a participant would say that the sound A in a trial is better than sound B, we would check if this dual is the same, taking the scores from obtained through the set of mean scores obtained by the group. So we took this metric because we didn't have any repeated trials that would allow to use some more common approach to evaluate inter-participant consistency. So on inter-participant consistency, we see that there are many effects of both independent variables of concepts and populations. And looking at the intra-participant consistency that we measured in a quite similar way as for compliance, but between test and retest trials, we only got here a main effect of the populations. So from this evaluation of consistency, we have two main informations. First, that the group of sound engineer here seems to be the most reliable considering the compliance and the retests. And looking at that graph, that brightness is the least consensual concept, while roughness is the most consensual. Now we're looking at the correlations between scores. So here you have all the correlations of scores between concepts for the two expert populations of sound engineers and conductors. And the first thing that we see is that there are similar patterns of relations. For instance, if you take the relations between roundness and warmth for the two populations, you have this positive correlation. The fact that there are non-significant relation between roughness and brightness, and that all the other relations are represented by negative correlations. Now, what's interesting here is when we compare to the non-expert relations, we have both similar and different relations with the relations of the experts populations. So here you have the similar ones, and here you have the different ones. So continuing with that, we also see that brightness seems to kind of showing the most variations on the relations, meaning that here, for instance, I just said that there are no significant relations between brightness and roughness for the experts, but we see here negative correlations. The same happens here. And another thing is that the negative correlations we obtain between brightness and roughness and warmth are significantly different between sound engineers and conductors. So before going into the acoustic analysis of those scores, let's listen a bit to the sounds. So here we will listen to it through the tool called CATAR, developed at IRCAM, that is a gradual synthesis tool. And we're going to try to, by listening to the sounds displayed on the left, to guess the relation that is one of the relation that you have on the right, that is from the sound engineer results. Yes. Sorry. So you might have recognized then the relation of roughness and brightness from a visual examination first, but with listening to the sounds. A second one that is maybe more obvious. Let's listen to it. And so here you might have recognized the relation, the positive correlation between warmth and roundness. So now that I'm done traumatizing your ears, let's go back to the acoustic analysis. So here again, the overall study. So talking about the acoustic analysis, we first performed these feature extractions on the orchestral sounds dataset. So using both the Librosa library and the Timber toolbox, we extracted spectral and temporal features that we refined doing a multicollinearity check. And we also took these meta features from the dataset, like the instrument or the playing technique. Then we used those data as inputs to a regression task, trying to predict the best worst scaling scores we just obtained by group and by concepts. So by doing a using a tree-based model from the XGBoost algorithms, and by using then the SHAP library that would allow us to predict, to explain the model strategies when predicting the scores. So really rapidly, the Shapley library is based on the computation of Shapley values. And so the Shapley value of one feature corresponds to its marginal contribution to the prediction of one sound score. And so the sum of all the features Shapley value corresponds to the difference between the predicted value and the average value of the dataset. So mathematically speaking, the Shapley values are the solutions of this equation below. Well, I don't have much time and so much the talent to explain it really thoroughly, but I invite you to read this paper that explains better than I would try to do, I think. So just to give you an example of the results, here you have an example for the participant group of sound engineers on the concept of brightness. So these are the top 5 most contributing features for brightness. Here you have the contribution, meaning that, for instance, if you take the most important feature here, that is the median spectral centroid, and here you have the contribution, you can see that the brightness would then grow with the value of the spectral centroid here. Here you have the importance of the feature. If this figure is not clear enough to see that, for instance, here you see that spectral centroid is way above the other features. And here you have the accuracy metrics corresponding to the prediction of the model. So talking about model performance, here you have all the top 5 most contributing features for all the combinations we have. And let's take a look at the accuracy scores for each prediction. And what you can see first is that brightness seems to have the lowest accuracy scores, while roughness has the highest across populations. And that sound engineers seems to provide the best predicted scores. So this information might remind you of the compliance score, the inter-participant consistency scores we obtained earlier. And actually, there is this strong correlation between them. So what it means here, which is interesting, is that the low accuracy scores might come from the fact that the agreement between groups of participants is not so strong sometimes. And it's interesting because it might explain that this way and not by the fact that the features we have are not representative enough of the dimensions we're trying to explain. And actually, talking about low performance, low accuracy results, there is this reference, interesting reference of the impact of accuracy on model interpretations that actually says using the same setup for analysis that we did, so the tree-based XGBoost model and the SHAP library. So this explains that even though the results of a model is not so good, the explanation we get still can still make sense and not be too noisy because of that. So now the last part, we move on to the explanation, trying to reveal the similarities and differences between groups of participants. So we observed an overall similarities in representations of roughness, warmth, and roundness across participant groups. So specifically for warmth, we see that the most important features above the others are the spectral median spectral centroid and ZF0. Specifically, the roughness would go in the reverse tendency compared to this median spectral centroid and ZF0. We have these same relations for roundness, but without an as strong contribution of ZF0 for the three populations. And for roughness, we have this contribution of the harmonic to noise ratio. And this metric I called MPS roughness, which I'll explain right away. It's actually a metric extracted from the modulation power spectrum of our sounds. So it was inspired by Lucarna's work on roughness. So it's actually the average energy that there is in between the range. It's within the range of 50 Hertz to 150 Hertz on the temporal axis of the modulation power spectrum. So one must ask then, what about brightness then? We observed, yeah, I think I'm a bit late. We observed that different facts that showed us that maybe brightness might embody the differences between groups. So first, I told you about the relations between the concepts. We saw that it was showing the least consistent results, and that you didn't see. There are the correlations of concept scores between participant groups, and we see that brightness has the lowest scores among the different concepts. So trying to explain it acoustically, so this you already saw. We said that according to sound engineering, brightness was overall explained by spectral centroid. Considering conductors, we see that spectral centroid is also the most important feature, but it seems to be more distributed here. So it can mean two things: either that the concept is more complex for conductors, or it's just because they didn't really agree so much on the concept explaining this distribution. And finally, for non-experts, what is interesting here is that they relied more on the F0 values than the spectral centroid and on noisiness. So in other words, according to non-experts, a bright sound will be a high-pitched sound with a low noise. So here we have a real difference between experts and non-experts populations on that concept. So in summary, with this study, we wanted to evaluate differences that may exist in the representation of this concept for three populations of different expertise. And so we did this overall study showcasing the use of base wave scaling in order to assess the acoustic subtleties of sound concepts. We got some behavioral results that allowed us to realize that sound engineers was in our groups the most consistent, and that brightness is the least shared concept across populations. And so we were also able then to explain those differences that we observed between concepts, between populations, and going further, and that would be explained, presented in the paper I'm writing at the moment. We can also explain those relations we saw between concepts for each population with the same acoustic fingerprints we measured. So thank you for your attention, and sorry for the delay.
This is the Musicians Auditory Perception or MAP project, which has a lot of different collaborators. And so if we can get anybody who's here, who's on that project, who wants to popcorn in, do it real quick. Unmute yourself, say your name, your institution, and what your role is there. And we'll see if we can do a quick popcorn. Anyone who's first?
Yeah, hello. I'll start quickly. I'm Florian Grond, research associate in the Shared Reality Lab at McGill and collaborator at CIRMMT. And I will say a few words at the beginning about the project, and I had started it with Berk.
Great. Who else?
Hey, my name is Berk Schneider. I'm a doctoral candidate here at UCSD, trombone player, but also very interested in timbre. And it's been a really great treat for me to work with all these musicians the past year on this project. So.
Thank you, Berk.
I can go next. Hello, my name is Pedram Diba, and I'm a composer. And I finished my master's studies in composition at McGill University in 2020.
Hi, my name is Jeanne Côté. I am a violinist. I did my master in McGill, and yeah, I'm excited to present this project today.
Hey.
Yeah, you go, Peter.
I'm Peter Ko. I'm a cellist here at UCSD for my DMA in performance, and I'm happy to be here and excited to present.
My name is Sang Song. I'm a PhD candidate at UC San Diego, and I was a participant composer of the project.
Hey, I'm Tiange. Just got my doctorate in composition from UC San Diego, and very excited. I'm also a composer participant of this project.
Great.
Okay, I think everyone did the popcorn, and I'll just say a few words before Berk will take over. Just say a little bit about how the project came into existence. It was in 2016 that I had the opportunity to work with my colleague, blind literary scholar and writer, Dr. Pieter Vos. And I talked him into wearing binaural microphones in an ethnographic study in which we tried to find ways to bridge through technology different sensory sensibilities between the participant Pete and myself, the researcher, and effectively turning both of us into researchers through the practice of binaural recording and listening. And excited with the results, we developed the concept of sonic boundary objects as an ethnographic method for participant observation, which I like to call participatory observation, as it is leveling the playing field between those who research and those who are researched. I was always interested in applying this to music, and I was fortunate to make a small pilot with Professor Alexis Hauser from McGill in 2018, while he conducted the Pronto Musical Ensemble here in Montreal. And later another small pilot with postdoc Julie Delisle during actor practicing sessions at the Université de Montréal. And both tests confirmed that it would be at the very least interesting to try and potentially artistically very productive. It was during a general actor meeting on Zoom in early 2020 that Professor Mato De Francisco called attention to my mentioning of this ethnographic approach. And it was also soon after this meeting that Berk reached out to me. After that, we were pondering how to move forward, and Professor Caroline Traub from Université de Montréal was so kind to encourage an application with an actor, and Professor Shahrokh Yadegari from the University of California, San Diego was so generous to endorse the project as actor member so that we could actually apply for funding, and we're very grateful for the support. And soon after that, Berk reached out to potentially interested colleagues, submitted the application that we both put together. and we got funded. And here I would like to say thank you, Berk, Jeanne, Pedram, Zhang, Peter, and Tiange, for bringing binaural recordings as sonic boundary objects to new heights in the field of composition and performance. As you will see and can hear in the project report, binaural practices inspired everyone to touch various aspects of composing and music making, including new forms of playing, notation, interaction between composers and musicians, and much more. So thanks everyone for the journey. And now I'd like to give the floor to Berk.
One second, I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. It's not letting me do Chrome. All right, well, I'll try this again in a second, but it's not working for some reason for me. So I'll take the baton from Florian. My name is Berk Schneider, and I already introduced myself. The goal of our project was really to adopt, as Florian mentioned, his approach to using binaural audio devices, except in our case, instead of using it to really better understand the tacit dimensions of disability, we really wanted to investigate how musicians who play different roles during the creative process may hear or understand timbre through personal experience and introspection. So, and at the same time, we really wanted to learn more about how these perceptions, each of our perceptions, are translated into language and notation during the creation process. So, which, as you can imagine, is an especially formidable endeavor when we are speaking about the unbounded creative process that is contemporary / avant-garde music. However, I really think we did come away with some very, very interesting and special insights, especially when it comes to the thick questioning that we use, the qualitative questioning we used, that revealed, and I speak here mostly for myself, these critical moments in which each musician used these binaural recordings to sort of relive and often reconsider their initial understandings of how sounds and timbre could be conceived, composed, and performed in space. So we focused on 4 main strategic lenses to break down each musician's interpretation. The first was a musician's individual relationship with their musical instruments. The second lens was this sort of self-reflective binaural approach to the creative process. The third was using this technology as a device for tacit knowledge exchange between participating musicians. And the final lens was this sort of idea of intention via notation in composition. And each composer and performer were sort of partnered up in a group. And in some instances, such as in my work with song, this meant sort of reconsidering the role of memory in space and how our minds sort of attentivize different timbres and sounds and how that can change what we perceive during the compositional process. I really think Pedram and Jeanne's work was especially meaningful in this regard because they were really rethinking a solo performance as sort of this intimate experience for the performer alone rather than an endearing audience. And I think for Peter and Tiange, they went so far to share their ownership of their final score, sort of citing that binaural listening helped break down certain subjective, objective walls when it came to understanding overtones on the cello. So I think the point here is that really each musician came away with, they came into the project with a clear idea of what they thought it meant to listen to timbre and what they thought it meant to come into a creative process with another individual. And I think they came away with an even clearer idea of how their approach to listening could be combined with another's perspective in this regard. So without further ado, without wasting too much more time, I'm going to try to figure out how to get the screen to share again so I can show you guys the module we made, which is pretty cool and interactive. And maybe,
yeah. Is there anything that we need to do on our end to get you to share? You should have permission.
I think it's just a browser issue. So let me switch to Chrome. I'm in like
okay.
something right now. So I'm going to share my screen, and then we can kind of go around to each group, and each group can talk a little bit about their. Here we go. I think it's going to work now. Can you guys see this?
Yes, looks
great. Let me share the desktop, but not the browser. So hopefully this is visible. Okay, so I guess let's just hand it off to Jeanne and Pedram. First, can discuss kind of your takeaways on your project together.
Okay, Jeanne, do you want to talk first, or you want me to go first? I guess I'll go. Okay, thank you very much. So yeah, Jeanne and I worked on a piece for violin and electronics, and the name of what we did, as you can see, is called Embodiment and Intimate Space. And so I want to talk a little bit first about our correspondence and how binaural recordings played a role in that. So from our very beginning, from our the initial correspondence that we had, we were both quite struck with the quality that we both were perceiving from the binaural recordings, and it was one of the qualities that was quite striking for both of us was space. The quality of space that was captured by the microphones, and this was a shared interest for us. But since we come from different backgrounds, composer versus performer, it was quite interesting to see how our interaction and correspondence gave shape to the discourse of our work together. For example, Jeanne, coming from the background of performing, has had the experience of experiencing the close space of a performer and how sound is perceived in that space. And one of the things she mentioned was, Jeanne, correct me if I'm misquoting you at any point, was how the binaural recordings kind of reminded her of that space because of all the subtle, quiet sounds that may not be necessarily perceived in a concert hall by the audience and is only perceived by the performer, are magnified with the binaural microphones. And for me, we had some shared approaches to space, but some of the differences was, for example, this from the performance side, and for my side was the movement of sounds and objects in space was something interesting. So it was through shared experiences and some differences that it was interesting to lead the discourse of the project. And then I also want to mention that it was quite interesting that binaural recordings help us discover new material for what we were working on. For example, finding out new sounds, or new sounds, for example, the little tiny subtle noises, to be able to rethink of them as musical material and use them in a piece. And also it gave us the possibility of thinking of the experience of embodiment in the piece of music. And one of the ways we realized that was through hair sound. And the hair sound was quite interesting for us because it combined the idea of the close space of the performer and also movement of sound in space, and also the experience of embodiment. One of the other things that I want to talk about is the notation that we went, because we as you can see, there's a lot of unconventional playing with the instruments. So we explored different clefs to communicate these ideas. And one of them is, for example, a weak clef to guide the, to exactly figure out how to move the instrument, to change the timbre and to also shape the movement. And yes, so Jeanne, do you want to continue?
Yeah, I don't know if you saw, but I had a problem with my connection, so I just came in and I don't really know where you're at. So just continue for a bit, and I'll join after.
So for the hair, we can see there's 3 lines coming out of the wig, and so when we were listening to the hair sound, experimenting with the hair sounds, we noticed that there's we could hear with the binaural recordings very quite distinct timbral change, and we came to the conclusion that there's 3 main timbral territories, and so each line is for one of the timbral territories. So this notation is interesting because it can show the direction of the timbre, and also it can show exactly how the performer is supposed to move the instruments, because later at the end the person with the wig also has a mouth, so it also indicates that not only top to bottom and to the front. So yeah, the clefs were right there, where the way we went with the notation.
Great, awesome. Do we want to listen to a little bit of this before we go on? Just like maybe 30 seconds, just so we can have an idea of what it sounds like. The recording's at the top. Here. Let me know if you guys can hear this.
I'm not hearing anything.
It might be quite soft.
No, Berk, we would only hear something if you activated sharing audio when sharing the screen. So maybe I suggest everyone is listening that after the symposium.
Okay, great. Okay, Tiange and Peter?
Sure. Okay, so first I would like to, thank the sponsor of Actors and everybody in the project. It has been a very inspiring process, especially this project is happening during the global pandemic and also my dissertation month. So I've been thinking a lot about, the human technology relationships of the creative process. Since the binaural microphone could actually catch some very, very subtle nuances of the timbres that is so close to the performer's body, which could barely share with others in the general like concert situations. So Peter and I were trying to, if we could empathetically share this experience to others, which is, barely have been heard in the concert hall. And there's also other thing we actually exploring in this piece is, the perception of time, because like we are, making some, we are talking about, if we could, when we think about the 1 minute or 2 minutes, 3 minutes during our listening time without like have a clock there or something, like what that could be different. So if you allow me to share the screen, let me see. Okay, there's also something wrong with it. So weird.
Okay. I can also share for you if you're gonna do.
Okay, yeah, if that's possible, great. Thank you, Berk.
And I'll click share sound now.
So in this score, you can see like I put that very clearly, like all the time there, like the durations there is depends on the performer's perception instead of like, actually have a clock there to have this current time. So every time like when Peter played this piece is like it's kind of in a very deep meditated situation to try to find in this interesting time. And you can see on this score like everything is almost everything is based on the G string. So we have like those very like small, like very subtle, like the performer body movement, which gives slightly different pressures on this like the specific like places of the sound and to triggers all the different overtones, and that become something very interesting. So the aim in the very beginning of the piece is trying to have like somebody like myself and all other audiences which could never be able to play cello like in the way like Peter can do that, but we can listen in this piece and fit ourselves into Peter's body and to thinking about like how if we could imagine our sound to be there. But it's very interesting, like when we finish everything, when we record everything, we like the piece, we will listen that back again. It's very interesting, like it's feel like this embodied and also like and not embodied, because our our body movement is not coexistence with the sound there. So it's making it's kind of mixed reality situation with the audience, which is as a listener and a half performer at that stage. All right, so Peter, you want to catch up from there? And by the way, it's definitely great about this because I want to share this piece as a co-authorship with Peter, because it's really, I could not find all those great sound without him. So I put him as a composer there as well. Please.
Thank you. I mean, I don't know if I would ever really consider myself to be a composer, but I will take that title, I guess. The perspective of sort of being able to share what I hear, I think is pretty special, that the binaural microphones sort of enable, and also the piece that Tiange then sort of allows for that process to unfold. And for me, one of the things that is very attractive about playing music is that it's often, even if it's just one string that is being played over the course of 10, 15 minutes, even that one note is sort of like this window into an infinite possibility. And it just depends on how I perceive it. And the roadmap that she created was just this very beautiful way for me to sort of explore into that infinite. And, in our conversations, we sort of realize that, oh, I hear this one way and she hears this another way. And for me too, as a performer, without Tiange, I wouldn't have realized certain things about sol ponticello and about the way I could sort of hear the sound. So it only helped me kind of understand things even further. And hope you guys can listen to it and enjoy it. But I think that's all I should say, because we should leave some time for questions and also Sang and Berk, right?
Great, thanks so much, Peter. Sang, would you want to do like a 2-minute spiel on your awakening moment during our duo project?
Sure. So like I'll be quick. So for me, binaural recordings and experience with the binaurality had a multiple layers of influence. So I'm not gonna get into the details as to how I made this inferential jump, but on one occasion, like it was mentioned previously, it was during the raging the phase of the pandemic. So we wanted to work together, but it had to be an outdoor space. So Berk and I gathered at a neighborhood park, and we made a recording of him playing the trombone. And I brought the recording home, and I listened to the recordings from him. I realized that there were so many details that I just didn't remember from being there. So that really made me rethink the role of memories in our mind. And so I eventually, long story short, I eventually decided to write a piece about entitled Anura. This is about the the broader Grimm story of the Frog King. So I'll skip the details as to how like memory is related to that story, but in this piece, what happens basically is at the end there are two threads intertwined at the beginning. So they're merged into, so one thread basically represents the frog, and the other thread basically represents the prince, and they're initially intertwined to form one thread, which is the frog, right? But eventually, in the course of the piece, those two threads are separated out, and the frog disappears, and only the prince remains. So the way I envision this piece, well, what partly inspired this piece is one of Professor McAdams' studies about how binaural recording is able to hear two different sound streams, which can be heard as one depending on the spatial location, right? So in this instance, I tried to separate the two layers, two streams towards the end by means of, like, by timbral means. So one thread has a, timbral and registral means. But in this in the recording that you'll be able to hear in the module, Berk and Florian did a great job with manipulating the recording to create binaurally separated threads. So in the end, the two threads are spatially separated out in the recording available in the module. So in that sense, the binaurality had multiple layers of influences, like inspiring me to come up with the subject matter, and then actually adopting the idea as a sort of the theoretical background for the piece. So that's about that's my spiel. Berk, would you like to add something?
Yeah, just that it was a joy playing your piece, and thank you so much for writing a piece for solo trombone. It doesn't happen so often. It was a creative, nice project. So yeah, I think we're done. We're gonna wrap it up. So if we can use the last 5 minutes for any questions.
So I'm Martin Daigle, and I'm a percussionist, and I'm completing my doctorate in classical percussion performance at McGill.
My name is Gabriel Couturier, and I'm currently studying composition at the University of Montréal, and I am in my master's degree.
Fantastic. So I'll actually get started with presenting this research. So essentially, it was a research creation specifically for the drum kit. So I'm very fascinated with drum kits and fascinated with all the sounds that you can make on the drum kit. I did notice that there are certain sounds that popular drummer can create on drum kits. Some sounds that are replicable regardless of the equipment. However, I've rarely seen this in classical compositions. So I thought this would be a great opportunity to present some of these sounds as a orchestration resource that composers and or conductors and others can have a look and see what kind of sounds they can make with the drum kit. During this process, we also found not necessarily new sounds, but some sounds that, let's say, I haven't played before, or I haven't seen other performers play. So to start off, the main instrument of this research was a standard drum kit. And this is just to say that standards for drum kits are always changing. So if you request a standard drum kit, you can expect just about anything. However, we can roughly agree on kick, snare, tom, floor tom, hi-hat, and crash and ride cymbals. So generally, your drum kit combines some toms, some headed instruments, as well as cymbals, which are metal. What's interesting is that they they don't necessarily bounce in the same way. A smaller cymbal doesn't really interact with your sound production tool in the same way. So this is also interesting to see how playing a certain extended technique on a snare drum, which is super tight, may be different when you play it on a floor tom, which is relatively more loose. So these things come into effect into the sound that it creates and also the timbre. So what we did, we looked at a variety of tools that we can use to make sounds on the drum kit. Some of these are relatively common, the bow. So we actually tried a lot of these on both the headed instruments and the cymbals. So some of these don't really work that well. And so we decided to not record them in our orchestration resource. So the hands, there are a variety of like thumb roll techniques, and that you can see. Also rubbing backwards on a head creates a weird variation on a thumb roll, which has maybe a higher harmonic that comes out of it. So it's quite interesting. Superball, I think many people are quite familiar with Superball. And in this case, and particularly to the Superball that I have, it's kind of double-headed, where the second end is made of plastic, and I can use that to generate some overtones on the cymbals. We use plastic brushes in a way that it's not necessarily intended to be used. Usually a brush is intended to be played as a normal stick or by rubbing, such as it is in jazz brush performance. But in our cases, we approach that differently. Actually, Gabriel, could you actually jump right back to the previous screen? There's actually another section that was quite interesting, is the prepared instruments. There's two prepared techniques that we tried with drum kit, which work quite well, is by adding Velcro to the drum kit, and with both sides of the Velcro, you can actually generate, you can activate the drums so they'll resonate, and also double-sided tape, which creates this weird kind of gluey effect, and this sound that you create is distributed in the drum as it is a resonating chamber. And to go forward even more with that idea, we elaborated with kalimba on snare and the Tibetan bowl. So a lot of these sounds that you create, they go through the drum, and then the drum resonates even more. So this is quite interesting, especially when used with the snare strainer, which causes an extra layer of grain to be added to the sound. We'll actually show you some of these in a little bit, so you get a better idea, but this represents about, I'm not sure, it's about 40 minutes of extended drum kit, similar to like a sample pack that you can get for just about any instruments. But we saw that there was no such thing for extended drum kit techniques, so we kind of wanted to fill this void as part of this research creation project. So, and we're going to show you the microphone setup.
Yeah, for the next part, it was for the recording, for a recording session planned to be at Tanna Hall on July 15, 2021. And for that, we had dialogues and discussed which kind of techniques we wanted to use. A lot were skimmed out, but we kept most of it. And we also collaborated with a sound engineer, Carolina Escobar Rodriguez, which presented and set up the whole the microphones for the kit. And yeah, Martin prepared a semi-structured improvisation based on the list that we chose. And do you want to add some more to this, Martin?
Yeah, I'll add a quick thing, which is I realize nowadays when working with composers on maybe it is an augmented piece or a piece for augmented drum kit and such. Often I get requests to send some samples of the drum performance, and in this case we're actually providing already a large library of drum samples which can be used in a certain patch, and as you can see there are many microphones to choose from. And all of this is actually available. All the stems of this session is available. So I think it could be a great resource to try maybe a certain patch for augmented drum kit, and also just to listen as well.
Yes. So here are some examples that we recorded.
Yeah, Gab, could you actually check if you click that button for sharing the stereo audio?
Oh, I'll reshare.
We vaguely hear a sound, but we're seeing the starting of the screen sharing, but we're not seeing a screen.
We'll just take a second.
All right, we've got the screen now.
So this is the second example using brushes.
Yeah, we actually thought that it'd be interesting to bring people into the drummer's seat to actually see some of these techniques. So by looking at this resource, you can actually determine maybe if something is possible, depending on how much work it is, from the first person point of view.
Yeah, and that was a really interesting it was a really interesting point for the creation part, because seeing the amount of implication that was needed for the performer, well, I could assess a kind of notation, or I could assess kind of ideas for the music, and see, and also get a feel for the composition, and getting familiar with the sounds and kind of attributing it as if they were an instrument I knew for a long time. This brings us to the second phase also. So with all these sounds and these recordings in parallel, we also conceptualized and also arrived at a notation process, elaborated draft patches and scores, and co-created a piece. So the conceptualization / notation part was at first getting familiar with the sound and seeing how they could be written. And so by looking at different works by Murray Schafer, Lars Thorsen, works that included audio sonology, and also Thor Magnusson, we found that different systems such as descriptive and prescriptive notation were fairly common and or simpler to write sound. So descriptive notation would be a subjective way to describe an action, such as study scores, traditional notation, and graphic visualization. And prescriptive notation would be prescribing an action to the performer. And I also thought it was important to visualize the sound and try to conceptualize it in my head by doing various drawings, sketches, and seeing which ways these sounds could be transmitted to the performer. So we had various dialogues, and we established that we wanted something like a semi-structured piece. So this included parts that were written out and also parts that were improvised. Another question was if we wanted the piece to be linear or non-linear. So we knew we wanted to integrate visuals. So we elaborated patches using MaxMSP, and we weren't sure if we were going to use a patch or a timeline. And we also wanted to possibly integrate drum triggers from the Sunhouse percussion. So these are some of the drafts from the patch, and we have imagery here taken from a 70s scary film. And here is one of a draft for a linear kind of notation using a choice structure and a rhythm structure. These are some of the first drafts using standard percussion notation. And here we see that we have the extended technique instrument written out, and it would be played or written as for a standard percussion. And here we have improvisatory text with vague time. So it kind of combined both written and improvisation, and it was still on a linear scale. Other example of drafts were like this, also on a timeline. So we have a note with various speeds being played, and this could include electronics or not. So this was a graphic equalizer and reverberation, but these were just tests. This is also an experimental notation with a reduced scale of the drum kit using different notes. And these were used for triggers, drum triggers also. We also questioned if we wanted to implement movement. So here we have some sort of movement playing at the same time with the brush on a membrane on a snare. And so these could follow. And some more subjective improvisation with lots of room for the performer. So the inclusion of movement was also a question, like I mentioned before. So drafting out the different movements from the first person point of view videos it was a great tool. It was a great tool to get familiar with the movement, but it was also superfluous to add these to the score. So, but these were, like I mentioned, great tools. But essentially the score ended up being a lot simpler than intended. So with our minimalist approach, it ended up being something like this. So all it is a musical value, or 3 musical values applied to each of these parameters. So we have either the choice of a tool, the choice of an instrument, and the choice of an image, the choice to produce a sound or the choice to produce silence. So all of these can be assigned a musical value, and essentially this was the score for the performer to perform. Do you have like for the performance, Martin, would you have things to add?
Yeah, so it's actually quite interesting, especially with the amount of trials that we've done to see how it's how we could apply some of the research that we've done to a creation. And in one of the former examples, it asks you to improvise on, it asks the performer to improvise on Velcro, which is like placed on the drum. And, you know, all of these, you know, can be pieces. This was the first one that actually made it to a concert hall. So what's interesting is actually the way that it happened. It was actually, eventually it was not a solo. I invited two performers to join me on stage, and we collaborated on this part. And the video, the 70s scary movie video, also suggested what kind of textures we should be creating. So that also influenced the choice of tool and the choice of instrument. So we can probably also show you an example of this performance. It's in Örebro, Sweden. And it also features Marie Levac on dance and Anders Astrand on vibraphone and marimba.
All right, well, so to conclude, I guess the piece was also meant for me to be more contextual, as seen as something more global, including this to the conclusion. All our recordings are going to be available in 96 and 48 kilohertz stereo audio, as individual stems and as the full recording session with individual tracks. So there's also the video, like you've seen, of the technique or techniques in first person point of view, which are going to be available via the tour module, and some are already available on YouTube. And the resource is going to include an overview of our approach, techniques, and some technical definitions, conventions, and implications. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I'm Lena. I am from McGill, and this is a project I collaborated with Mengqi Wang, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Mengqi Wang, or Wang Mengqi in Chinese, and I'm a doctoral student co-supervised by Shanghai Conservatory of Music and the Université de Strasbourg, and my major is musicology. And today Lena will do the presentation for us.
Thank you, Mengqi. And Mengqi is on the other side of the world, 12 hours ahead of us. So thank you for getting up so early in the morning. Okay, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for being here today for my presentation on this project. So opening his paper about the psychological constraints on form-bearing dimensions in music, McAdams observes that from a listener's perspective, quote, the existence of artistic form is often intangible, fleeting, fugitive, end quote. Even so, there is a psychological reality of musical form which may be achieved through the organization of mental representation of musical constituents and musical knowledge, leading to a comprehension of musical structures. How well a perceptual dimension affords perceivable configurations would affect the potential that dimension has to bear form. For instance, listeners are able to easily arrange a sequence of pitches and recognize when it is heard again, and thus pitch organization can be a very important aspect used in musical comprehension. Techniques of orchestration therefore has to take into account the ability and limits of human perception so as to achieve musical effects that is perceptible and comprehensible to a listener. Orchestration treatises provide strategies for the utilization of instruments in various ways to achieve a desired sonic effect, but researchers such as Sandel and Goodchild and McAdams have demonstrated that these techniques could be guided by perceptual principles, and an understanding of these perceptual principles can highlight musical features which are perceptually salient in listeners and which could be used to explain the effectiveness of certain orchestration techniques. In his orchestration textbook, Adler discusses 5 ways in which the percussion section has been traditionally used in Western orchestral scores. The first is to simulate march music or to provide an ethnic flavor. Secondly, the percussion section can be used to emphasize accents and provide general rhythmic activity. It is also often used in building up to or capping a climax. Dramatic beginnings to pieces of music can also be created by percussion instruments. And finally, the percussion section is also used to color certain pitches or even entire passages by doubling other instruments in the orchestra. Piao contrasts this way of writing for percussion instruments in his orchestration book for the Chinese orchestra. He observes that Western percussion instruments, even while they may have instances of being soloistic, rarely stand alone outside of the supportive role most of the time. In China, on the other hand, the long history of percussion ensembles in folk traditions, as well as the role of percussion in operas, created and developed characteristic roles for percussion instruments. As these instruments become incorporated into the Chinese orchestra, the traditional percussion roles are also absorbed into the orchestral writing, and very different uses of percussion instruments can be seen. While Chan did not specifically compare the differences between percussion writing in Western and Chinese orchestras, he talked about the characteristic uses of particular Chinese percussion instruments, highlighting similar observations Piao has about these characteristic roles percussion instruments play traditionally. Composed by Zhou Shirui in 2006, 12 Questions on Heavenward Questions was commissioned by the Youth and Music Festival in Berlin and the Composition Committee of Shanghai Music Conservatory. The Chinese poet Qu Yuan wrote the epic poem Heavenward Questions that questioned the mysteries of the heavens and the earth. In the composer's own words, this piece, quote, should be understood just like heavenward questions without being answered if imagination could unify music and words, and there are no essential differences in human nature between the past and the present, the East and the West, end quote. This piece is written for a Western orchestra and solo dizi, a Chinese transverse bamboo flute. In addition, there are several Chinese percussion instruments that are used. With this unique combination of instruments, the composer has to utilize different orchestration techniques so that the piece sounds unified. Being a piece with a fundamentally Chinese background in its programmatic content, the composer also has to take into consideration how the predominantly Western orchestra could reflect this content. As you can see in this percussion instrumentation page, Zhou utilized a large number of percussion instruments here. Both the Western and Chinese percussion instruments are often used together. The style of writing, however, does not solely depend on whether a particular instrument is a Western or Chinese percussion instrument. A group of Chinese percussion instruments could be used to create effects reminiscent of what is commonly seen in a Western orchestra and vice versa. For the rest of the presentation, I'll be talking about how the percussion section in this piece is used in 3 areas: for rhythmic accentuation, as a melodic instrument, and taking a gestural role. One of the uses of the percussion section in a Western orchestra is to emphasize accents and provide general rhythmic activity. This can be seen right at the beginning of this piece, where first the timpani is used to accentuate the beginnings of each 2-measure phrase. From measure 11, 2 other Chinese percussion instruments, the tanggu, the Chinese drum, and the big bass luo or tam-tam, join the timpani. However, even with the addition of these 2 Chinese percussion instruments, the function of the percussion section here is still as a rhythmic accent, and the instruments do not stand outside of this supportive role. Okay, let's listen to this section, and I hope the sound works here. Apologies for the cat timbre that is included in the music. Right, the bangzi, Chinese wood drums, and bangu, the little Peking opera drum, have very strong associations with the Chinese operatic tradition and bring along with them strong melodic and dramatic connotations. They are often used to keep the beat for the singer, not only in metrical passages, but also in metrically freer ones. In many Chinese opera traditions, it is not uncommon to have passages in which the singer and/or the melodic instruments sings a metrically free passage while the rhythmic section keeps a steady pulse. This is often used to heighten the tension and to contrast and/or highlight the emotions of the singer. In addition to these types of passages, another use of the bangu is in mirroring the rhythmic patterns of the vocal and melodic lines. These uses of the bangzi and bangu can be seen in this video. With these connotations, listeners experienced in Chinese music likely form strong associations with the melodic line upon hearing the bangzi being used in this very specific way. Towards the end of the first question, from around measure 22 that I'll show in this video, the percussion instruments start coming into the melodic foreground, transitioning from having a supportive role into a more prominent one. While still carrying a similar rhythmic pattern as other groups of instruments, the use of rim strokes makes the percussion lines stand out more, and the segregation of the percussion section from the other groups takes place. In this next video, you can hear the entry of the bangzi at measure 28, creating a clear melodic line together with rim strokes on the timpani. Listeners experienced with percussion instruments in Chinese opera will likely associate this bangzi line with a melodic line easily. However, the associations are not only due to learned connotations by experienced listeners. Perceptual principles also guide listeners' attention towards this clearly segregated line. Firstly, the sharp and bright sounds of the bangzi and the rim strokes on the timpani increase the salience of this group of instruments. In addition to rim strokes, the set of different bangzis allow for a relative variation in pitch, and even though it is not absolutely tuned, some form of pitch relations can be established. This pitch variation makes it easier to create not only rhythmic variation, but also melodic variation, drawing listeners' attention towards the percussion section as a separate independent layer. There is a wide variety of unpitched metallophones in Chinese percussion instruments used traditionally in operas, processions, and ritual music, amongst others. The common use of these instruments in these types of settings have created a strong association of them with particular gestures, and sometimes quite specific ones, for listeners experienced with Chinese traditional music. Even though these metallophones are unpitched, each one of them has a unique timbre, and the use of them in combination creates a range of different timbres that can be perceived as a timbral melody. With this range of timbres and the rhythmic combination of them, it is not difficult, even for a listener who might not be experienced in Chinese music, to form associations with gestures and movements. An example is given in this video where the combination of various timbres of the percussion instruments creates vivid connotations to gestures and movements, here specifically of the monkey king wreaking havoc in the heavens. Although luos, the Chinese gongs, are unpitched percussion instruments, depending on the angle and position at which it is hit, a tone that slightly changes in pitch can be produced. These pitch-changing tones allow for gestural associations to be made, or an idea of some kind of movement. Woolmark and Kendall believe that metaphorical descriptions of sounds constitute conceptual representations that are hybrids of various frames of references. In the sound of the law, the physical or activity frame of reference appears to dominate an easily made association between the timbre, pitch, and connotations of movement. This type of association, once again, does not require a listener to be experienced in Chinese music or operatic genres. Even though metallophones have appeared before this point in the piece, they have been used more for creating a dramatic entry and less in the context of gestural connotations. The first appearance of metallophones in the capacity of gestural connotation appears towards the end of question 3 at measure 68, seen here. Although only a short 3 measures, the combination of low brasses with the small and medium lows create an impression of a comic character in an opera, a 丑角, striding onto the scene. Comic characters, in addition to providing humor to a scene, can also be used to question philosophical ideas or put across moral ideas that may be stilted or wearisome and banal if conveyed by other characters. It seems apt for the entry of such a character in a work questioning the philosophical questions that are being asked in the poem. Both melodic and gestural elements work in conjunction between measures 107 to 119 shown in this video. In addition to the instruments in the percussion section, the harp is also used here in a percussive manner. The entire percussion section and harp form a stratified layer here, clearly distinct and comparable in melodic importance to the solo dizi. The drums, tanggu, and set of 5 paigus form the basis of the melodic line, and in conjunction with the small and medium luos, a lively animated musical line is created. From measure 115 onwards, the harp is also used in a surprisingly percussive way, imitating the sound of the luos. So to conclude, we can see that percussion instruments are used in a unique way in this piece. There are sections in which the percussion writing is clearly in a style usually found in orchestration for Western instruments, and there are other sections in which the percussion is written in a clearly Chinese style. Even though Western and Chinese percussion instruments are used, it is not the tradition of the instrument that dictates the style, whether Western or Chinese, of the percussion writing, but rather the ways in which they are written. The unique ways in which Chinese percussion instruments are used can be traced back to the traditions of folk instrumental ensembles and Chinese operas, and listeners with prior experience in these genres of music will find it easy to form associations between the percussion sounds and the musical narratives or ideas. However, these connotations are also not arbitrary, and certain aspects of it are based on perceptual principles, such as auditory streaming and segregation principles. This means that although musical associations with the narratives and musical ideas are learned from experience, the ways in which musical elements are used and the techniques for orchestrating particular effects are not simply arbitrary. This piece demonstrates a unique example of how a composer might orchestrate a piece of music that uses predominantly Western orchestral instruments such that they work in conjunction with the sounds of the few Chinese instruments present to create the aesthetics and a narrative based on culturally Chinese ideas. Other techniques might be utilized in different pieces of music, creating varied and diverse effects, but most importantly, the success with which these effects may be perceived by listeners is strongly guided by basic perceptual principles. Thank you very much, and here are our references.